Hi, everyone. So welcome to Module 2. This week we're going to find out how that we are going to look for research articles and how to use sources of evidence, and so specifically talking about different types of evidence-based information and systematic reviews. So your assignments for this week are a research worksheet, to use your Zotero library and share it with me, and then also identify your research problem. You have a quiz and a discussion board as well. And so on your worksheet, you're just going to download it from the materials file and then fill it out and then upload it into the assignment box that's appropriate. And then for the Zotero library, you will share with me so you can paste the link to your library that you share in the assignment. And then you have your research problem assignment too. And so one thing that on the discussion board I wanted to talk about briefly is your research interest. So make sure that you go back into Module 1 and look at that spreadsheet. And if nothing really interests you in the spreadsheet that you want to work on with a faculty member for your research, contact me and let's talk about it and see what kind of research plan we can set up for you so that you can work on something that'll be really beneficial for you. So the other thing about the discussion board is I loved your videos and I want you to continue posting another video. And so the 3 articles that I've posted in the materials folder, so the New York Times article, another science article, and then the Chronicle of Higher Ed science article. I want you to read these 3 and think about them in the context of the article that you read last week, the articles that they mention in their reviews or their editorials, and then also what you said in your video about that research article, and then post a review of it and just your thoughts on it in general. Some things that I want to mention after watching your videos is that, you know, no research is perfect. And so my first research coordinator job, I was working for a health psychologist, and he literally wrote all of the coding and the diagnostic criteria for binge eating disorder and bulimia and anorexia, as well as obesity. And so he had been doing extremely high level research since the late 70s at this point, and this was in early 2000s. And you know, he said to me one time when I was trying to explain to him, because he's my boss, why I couldn't get the data that I needed to be as clean as it needed to be, and I couldn't get it all at one time, and all of these different factors. And he just looked at me and he said, Alicia, the only way that research would be perfect is if we kept all of those children that you're trying to get information on in a lab and fed them the same food and made them do the same activity every single day, and then that would be unethical. And he said, and it still wouldn't be perfect research because that's not the way people live. So that's really stuck with me. There is no perfect research, but what we can do is try to get as close to it as we can so that we can generalize or we can make estimations. So I like that you were picking out some of those details that needed to be improved upon. But one thing that I want to just reiterate is that there is no such thing as anything perfect, much less perfect research. So sometimes you have to understand that we have gold standards like experimental studies, and we do the best that we can to mimic what it would be like. And then once we have a gold standard or high quality research, we can generalize that into a population. Something else that I wanted to talk about, and that was you know, the journal that was published in was a very high tier journal, and it doesn't have the kind of impact factor that, you know, the Journal of the American Medical Association has, but it has a really decent impact factor. And that's not a comment on the journal or the peer reviewers. They were lied to, essentially. And so it's hard to detect that unless it's kind of obvious. And so we do our best to maintain rigor in research, and that's the importance of the peer review process, but it shouldn't be a negative reflection necessarily on that journal. And, you know, at the end of the day, there can't be one research study that solves all of the problems, and so, or all of the questions. So you always go back to the original purpose. And so in that study, if you go back to the original research purpose, it was just one sentence of the research purpose. And so, they spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to figure out the answer to one question. And you're going to find that's what you need to do too, because if you ask a ton of questions, it becomes too big of a project and there's too much noise. And so a research career is based on one study at a time to accumulate evidence to make recommendations. I also want you to watch this me search versus research and then the quantitative versus qualitative, because this quantitative versus qualitative and the me search will help you bridge what we learned last week to what we're going to learn next week, and I want you to stay up on that. So when we talk about Module 2, it's pretty brief. So Chapter 2 is how to find appropriate research articles. And I definitely hope that you've had some kind of library tutorial somewhere in your past. Know that most of you had something at UCA if you were a UCA student. And so if you haven't had that tutorial, you can either let me know and I'll be happy to walk you through some of the databases that we have available to us, or you can go to the uca.edu/library site and actually look at tutorials that are there that the librarians have provided for you. So we start out with that nutrition advice and recommendations, and this really isn't just about nutrition. This is about, if you're a FACS educator, this is about the education recommendations that you have for the best techniques or technology to use. They need to be based on science. And so research and practice is mentioned over and over again in our standards for performance. It's also mentioned in best practices for educators. And so research articles are found in a lot of different places. They're found in databases, they're found on Google Scholar, everywhere. And so what we see in magazines and newspapers are written by journalists, and usually they find a research article that's really interesting, and then they make it even more sensational by turning it into something that people can read very easily and very quickly, maybe even just a paragraph. And so you don't get the full picture of what that is actually, research actually was. Trade publications are usually written by people in a specific profession or even by journalists. They are anything from factual to opinion. And trade magazines are also called trade journals, and they're about certain types of industry. So like today's dietitian is about dietetics, and then Nation's Restaurant News is about food service. There's education journals, and like the Journal of Higher Ed or the Chronicle of Higher Ed is a trade journal all about issues that come up in higher education. And then you have scholarly or academic journals. And so this is where you want to get all of your research from. So this is journals that publish original research articles to an audience of researchers and students and professors. And I don't want to see any articles that don't have peer review. And then typically the outline is an abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. And so that's what your research proposal is going to look like at the end of the semester, is abstract, introduction, and methods. But we stop at methods because you're not collecting results or anything in this semester. So with journals, you can have different types of submissions. And so in the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, you have practice, applications, research, and then from the Academy. In the Journal of Family and Consumer Sciences, you have research briefs, editorials. And so there's different types of articles that can be submitted in all kinds of different journals. So the journal is set up a little bit differently, and every journal is different. And so the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition is a very, very prestigious journal. And so they have research articles that are split into specialties because they have such a volume of articles that are submitted. They can do that. JAMA is the Journal of the American Medical Association. That is one of those journals, if you get published in, that's kind of like the apex of a career for a researcher. And so they have a lot of different types of articles that they allow. Like I was saying, the Journal of Family and Consumer Sciences. So I linked to the author guidelines there, and you can see all of the different types of manuscripts they will take. And then also like the Journal of Interior Design. So they might have a similar word count or a similar basis for what they are, but they might have different names in every journal. And so what is peer review? Peer review is when you submit a journal or a journal article or a manuscript to a journal, and they assign, like there's an editor of the journal, and then they assign it to reviewers to go over. And so usually whenever I get a journal article to review from a journal, I'm the one that's responsible for the statistics part of it. And so depending on the type of journal, they may ask you to review the whole manuscript, or they might just say, okay, you review the methodology, you review the stats, or you review the whole thing, but focus on the stats, whatever they feel comfortable with. Usually you have 3 reviewers that review every manuscript. And then also usually you get feedback on either it's just completely rejected, which happens unfortunately to me more than I would like to admit. So in that case, you just submit it somewhere else. And then you can get resubmit and revise, or you can get accepted. And so it's very, very rare. I mean, I've never done it, and I've never heard of anybody that just had an article accepted to a journal without revisions being requested. So if we look at each study, how do we know what it's an example of? So healthcare in the US, a right or a privilege. So think about that title, and which would you choose? Original, research editorial, narrative review, or systematic review? To me, it kind of sounds like an opinion, so I would say probably it's an editorial. And then statins for prevention of cardiovascular disease in the US, evidence report and meta-analysis. Well, that already tells me that it's a meta-analysis, and so I know that if it's a meta-analysis, it's had a systematic review to get to the meta-analysis. And then nutrition assessment of the older patient, a narrative review, it gives the answer away. And then a decrease in screen time predicts lower BMI in adolescents. So to me, that sounds like original research because it's a very small research question that somebody could answer in one manuscript. So scientific journals have a digital object identifier, or a DOI. The DOI is kind of a static address, and so what happened before we had DOIs was something would get published and then it would kind of just get indexed on the website, but a lot of times they were indexed as PDFs, and PDFs aren't searchable by things like Google, so you could never find that article again. And then also there became such an abundance of manuscripts and actual journals that it was really hard to find anything. And so there had to be some way to identify digitally every single article for every single journal for every year. And so that's where we got the DOI. And it is a static identifier. And then we have an impact factor, which is the frequency with which an article in a journal has been cited in a specific time frame. And so if you just Google impact factor and look at Wikipedia, it has a formula for how it's calculated. But what you need to know about the impact factor is that it kind of speaks to the prestigiousness of a journal. And so, like I was saying before, JAMA has a really high impact factor. I mean, we're talking probably in the 40s compared to like the sensory perception one that's like a 1. And then some of the ones that we publish in locally don't even have an impact factor because they're not indexed. And so the impact factor can be used at the first university that I taught at. We had to state the impact factor and the acceptance rate for every journal that we published in because they wanted the impact factor for our journals to be fairly high. So you can't just submit a publication to any journal and get it accepted and it count for your promotion. It has to be a journal of a certain prestige to count towards your promotion. Not all places do that. Usually the places that are higher in research demand would do something like that. And then there's open access journals. And open access journals are journals that you don't have to have a subscription to. And so you could just go directly to it, like PLOS One or PLOS One is an open access journal. But these can be predatory journals and very, very problematic. So, I really avoid any journal that makes me pay them to submit an article. So, it may be $25 and that's a different story. But if it's $2,500 to submit my manuscript, I can go somewhere else. It's not worth it. And so, again, a lot of places, especially for researchers like myself, if I put that name of a journal on my resume or my curriculum vitae for promotion, the reviewers looking at it would get probably pretty upset because it looks like you bought your publication. And so that's one issue that's coming about with open access journals, is if they're predatory and if people are actually buying publications, thus buying their promotions and doing shoddy research. And then the nutrition related journals, so this is a list of those, and any of these could also be used for other disciplines, just like this isn't the all-conclusive list for nutrition. So then gray literature, dissertations and theses are a part of gray literature. And I strongly suggest looking at ProQuest dissertations and theses as a database if you're interested in doing a thesis, so that you can kind of see what the format looks like. And then any conference proceedings. So like when I talk about submitting an abstract, or you have to submit an abstract, that is an abstract that you write from your research that is submitted to peer review for a conference. And if they accept it, then your abstract is accepted and you make a poster, a research poster, which will be the end product for you for this semester. And that's how you disseminate research. But usually your abstract is published in a book that the people at the conference get, and not necessarily as a journal. Technical reports, a perfect example of what a technical report is on the Institute of Child Nutrition website. And I link to their research page, and you can scroll down a little bit, and they have a whole section that says technical reports. And it's similar to like a white paper where you do research and then you report just the facts. And a lot of times legislators can use these types of reports to make legislation. And then there's also commentaries and opinion pieces that are based on research. So when you want to use a database to find a journal article, you can use Medline and PubMed, Web of Science, Scopus, or Science Direct. So Torreyson Library, again, is our library on campus, and they have an amazing amount of resources for the size of our university. And if they don't have it, they can get it through interlibrary loan so easy and quickly. It's amazing to me how effective and efficient our librarians are at UCA. And so if you want to know if a journal is available through our university library, you go onto the library website, and then you navigate to journals, and then you would just copy and paste or type in the name of the journal that you want to know about, and it'll pull up and see if it's available. It'll tell you the years it's available, if it's in print in the library, all of those different things. And so Science Direct and Academic Source Complete are my favorite databases to use. So it is important to understand how to search using keywords. And so this is using PICOS, which is Population Intervention Control or Comparison Outcome and Study Design. And so from that PICOS, they identified keywords in the literature, in the article. And so that really helps us as we're searching for articles to be able to use the PICOS terminology to find articles that are relevant to what we're looking for. And then with subject headings are called mesh headings. And if you create your own subject headings, that's a bad thing, because people aren't going to be able to read your mind and figure. It's not like hashtags on Instagram. They're very specific headings. And so when you go into Medline and PubMed, you can search for the mesh heading and then use that as a keyword for you or for your article. And so if you look by keywords, you choose the keywords. If you look by subject heading, you have to use the specific subject heading that can get you to a keyword. And so make sure that you understand the differences in the way that you can search. So Medline is free, and unfortunately, not all of the articles that they provide are free, but usually I would say 1 out of 10 isn't through our library. And so PubMed also includes papers that are, or articles that are ahead of print. And so it might just be an e-publication and waiting for the journal to catch up and go in print, which is super helpful because it helps you get the most current research that's out there. So MESH, you usually have 10 to 12 different MESH headings, and the MESH headings are assigned by the National Library of Medicine. And so when you use PubMed, you go onto the MESH database and you can enter what you're interested in and search for it, and then look for the kind of headings that are closest to what you want, and then do a search based on that. So with any kind of search, really, you want to avoid multiple search terms together, any imprecise terms or prepositions, and then you don't want to use acronyms or abbreviations because it's going to pull the wrong thing. One thing that I do want you to know how to use are Boolean operators like and, or, and not. And so if you're searching for red meat and cardiovascular disease, then you probably need to put quotes around red meat and specify and then quotes around cardiovascular disease. Because if not, it could pick up things like red disease. And so you want to be very careful with the way that you use your search terms. Google Scholar is okay, but it brings up a lot of things that are not journal articles, and I don't want to see anything that's not peer-reviewed original research. And so you can refine it, but also Google Scholar provides things that aren't necessarily indexed, and so it might be very difficult to find the actual research article. And then you have Agricola, CINAHL, Cochrane, which is a database of systematic reviews only. ERIC is specific to the discipline of education, food science and technology, and then PsycInfo, which, as you would guess, is a lot of psychology research. So Agricola is very helpful in nutrition and dietetics, as well as CINAHL. And then ERIC is very helpful. The only problem that I have with ERIC is that when you look for things, sometimes it pulls stuff from the 70s and 80s because ERIC has been around for a while and they've indexed a lot of literature. So when you think about what articles you're going to select, make sure you choose the correct type of article. And I'm telling you now that I want original peer-reviewed research. Be selective about the date. I want nothing older than 6 years unless you have a specific reason why you need it to be older. If it's seminal research, or maybe you already have 20 references that you need and these are just some great articles that really lay a foundation, then you can use those older ones. You need to make sure that the research isn't just an abstract, that it actually is a full manuscript, that it's relevant. And if you need help, talk to the librarian or myself. And on the uca.edu website for the library, they have, I can't talk to a librarian or librarian help or research guides. I can't remember. I think it's called Research Guide. And you can set up face-to-face or online conferences with a reference librarian to help you figure out how to use the database. So with your scientific writing, you need to be organized, professional, unemotional, and practical. And so that's something that I really have to work a lot with as you guys start writing professionally and for scientific writing, technical writing, is that you're unemotional. You don't have an opinion. You are reporting what the research is telling you. And it also needs to be very organized. You're not telling a story. You're not writing a narrative. You're telling a technical synopsis of the research that you've gathered and leading the reader into why you're about to do the research that you're proposing. And you need to use the active voice and pick appropriate action verbs, and no, not, ever, any prepositions. You need to omit needless words. So again, we're not talking about a narrative. You just say the facts. Before you start a rough draft, you need to read everything that you have and write some notes. And then you want to revise and edit your rough draft. And you always want to use your own words. So no plagiarism. And please use quotations sparingly. And I put that in the biggest font because I cannot stand quotations in technical writing, because it tells me that you haven't thought for yourself. You haven't done any thinking on your own. You're just trying to report what somebody else has said. So be very careful not to use quotations, but also be very careful that you do use your own words. Okay, so in chapter 12, we're talking about the sources of evidence, systematic reviews, evidence-based nutrition. And so systematic review is a process that you use to get to a clinical practice guideline. So it doesn't have to be a clinical practice guideline. It could be an education guideline that you use in classes. But what we want to make sure is that there's a systematic process that has reviewed all of the research to get to that point. So if we think about a meta-analysis, is it performed in a qualitative study? Is it a synthesis of findings from both kinds of studies? Or is it performed in a quantitative study? So remember, a meta-analysis uses numbers and effect size, and so it would be probably a quantitative study. A meta-synthesis uses words more because you're synthesizing information, so that's probably qualitative. And then a mixed method systematic review would be findings from both qualitative and quantitative. So systematic reviews have a very focused research question. They involve a comprehensive literature search, and they have a very rigorous process to evaluate studies for bias. They usually include a meta-analysis, and they use a very explicit and thorough process. So a systematic review is just that. It's very systematic. So the first thing you do is formulate your research question and the purpose of the review. So a systematic review actually is a research study, because you're going in the literature to gather up all of the research that's been done, and you need to report it about how you're going to, on what your research question is. So the first thing is that they have, in the example, developed a research question. Do behavioral weight management programs involving diet and physical activity lead to greater weight loss at 12 months than those programs involving diet only or physical activity only? And so just that research question tells me that there's probably going to be a lot of research to review to see if it can be included in the systematic review. So then you define your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you can see that they said they only want overweight and obese adults, they only want randomized controlled trials, and they excluded studies if weight loss was a part of treatment for any medical disorder. And so you can have as many inclusion and exclusion criteria as you want. And so for this research question, there's probably hundreds of thousands of research articles on that topic. And so you would want to set that it has to be a randomized control trial. And then it says develop a search strategy with databases, keywords, and key journals. And so that's when you start thinking about inclusion and exclusion criteria, about the journals you're going to use, impact factors for those journals, and then the dates that you're going to look for research. So they've said 2009 through 2012. And then you do your literature search and you identify all the possible studies. And so the search identified 2,000 records plus other sources, which was 257. Any duplicates were removed. And so then you screen the records like through with the abstracts, make sure that they truly meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but you have to keep a very specific log of excluded studies. So when they got to their 2,223 records, 2,016 were excluded. So that's huge. You know, they've excluded the majority of them. But that still means they have 200 something to review. So that's a lot to review. And then you look at the full text of the selected studies and critically assess them. So of the remaining 207 studies, they eliminated 199 because they weren't randomized controlled trials, or they didn't gather body weight at 12 months, or for another reason. And so what you get then is this table that you have, and also with systematic reviews, you have kind of like an algorithm to show the readers how you eliminated and why you eliminated all the different articles. And so this is when they're looking at the bias between a systematic review and the meta-analysis. And so this is direct comparisons with the behavioral weight management program. So this is the flow diagram of information. So this is where you would say, okay, I identified 2,000 whatever that they identified in the database and 257 with other records. I removed this many duplicates, so now I have 1,800. Then I screened this many and excluded 2016 from that. And so you go through until you get to the very bottom where you say the studies included in my quantitative analysis were 7. So you go from 2,000 something to the number that you actually included. So then you put together the study's findings, summarize and discuss the findings, and finish it up for publication. So what this is saying is that 6 of the studies compared combined behavioral weight management programs to diet only. Meta-analysis showed a significantly greater weight loss in the combined programs at 12 months than the diet only. And then 5 studies compared the combined programs to physical activity only studies and showed a greater weight loss in combined programs at both 3 and 6 months to 12 and 18 months. So it's saying that in both instances, the behavioral weight management programs that have diet and physical activity were most successful. So now we look at when we assess the risk of bias. The first thing we have to think about is random sequence generation. So there's a low selection or a low risk of selection bias if there was truly a randomized process that was done. So if researchers came up with a sequence that was generated by birth dates or participant preference or color or the third thing in the list, then there is a higher risk of bias. Allocation concealment, so there's a low risk of bias if researchers can't foresee the group into which they're assigned. And so these are some of the principles behind a true experimental randomized control trial. Blinding of participants and personnel, it also reduces bias. Blinding of the outcome assessment reduces bias. Incomplete outcome data can increase the risk of the bias, because if you have a weight loss program and you're looking at the people who dropped out of the study, there's probably similar characteristics for those people that dropped out versus those that stayed in and finished. And so you could have bias in your results based on who dropped out or who quit or those types of questions. And then also, you have to be careful that the researchers don't have selective outcome reporting. So look at all the variables that they collected in their actual research question and compare that to what they report. And if there's things that are big gaps, then you need to be very considerate of the fact that they might have had unfavorable results in one area and just chose not to report those. So a meta-analysis is a statistical technique to look at the results of a number of studies combined. So what we want to look at is a big effect of an intervention or treatment from multiple studies. And so you can get pretty important information from combining all of those studies together. The effect size is a statistic that shows the magnitude of the relationship between two variables or the magnitude of the difference between groups on a variable. So effect sizes really help you summarize the results of different studies into a meta-analysis and kind of, in a way, tell you how powerful those results can be to be generalized to other clinical-based guidelines or things that you do in the classroom or things that you do in clinical. So when you look at a meta-analysis, usually the studies that have more participants carry more weight. And that's because they have more participants. So within that study, their effect size is better or higher. And then heterogeneity of studies. Heterogeneity is variation between the direction and the magnitude. And so ideally, in different studies, your results are going to be similar for the same research question, or there needs to be a lot more research done. And so if results are significantly different across multiple studies, then that tells you that you need to dig a little bit deeper into that question and the articles or the manuscripts that you've read. So to get systematic reviews and guidelines, we can go to the National Nutrition Evidence Library from the United States Department of Agriculture. We can go to the Cochrane database, or we can go to the National Guidelines Clearinghouse. And so there are also systematic reviews and guidelines in ERIC, the education database, that we can use. So if you have any questions, or anything this week or about the Zotero use, make sure you post in the discussion board in the Zotero module, and we have a librarian that will be updating and checking that discussion board to help answer your questions. And then anything that you need related to your research topic, picking a topic, discussing what your research is going to look like, any of those things, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk about that with you, and I hope you have a great week.